Late last night, Checkpoint was leaked a copy of the contract between EQC and Fletcher Construction for the management of the Canterbury Home Repair Program. As far as we're aware, this 31-page document has never been made public. The leak followed our coverage of scopes and repairs that appear woefully inadequate. Major earthquake damage was simply not found. Homes were repaired, but sometimes without serious structural damage being addressed or even seemingly noticed. After that story, National's new EQC spokesperson Stuart Smith told us the Crown entity should sue Fletcher's over substandard work. But the leaked contract reveals a striking section, 23, indemnity. In it, EQC indemnifies Fletcher's for all costs, expenses and claims made against it. The contract is signed by E.M. Simpson, CEO of EQC, and Mark Binns, who was then Chief Executive Infrastructure of Fletcher Construction, although he left within a year to become the CEO of Meridian Energy. We called him, expecting he, like everyone else involved at senior levels at that time, would decline to talk to us, but he described an under-resourced and off-guard EQC trying its best to cope with an unprecedented event, unrealistic timeframes from the government and scopes for damage being done too fast, sometimes by people who simply shouldn't have been doing them at all. And he said without an indemnity, no private contractor large enough to manage the work would have touched it, and it was simply too big for EQC.
We started talking to the government and EQC straight after the first earthquake, and I think it's fair to say that EQC was probably not in a ready state to deal with such a large catastrophic earthquake. That's just the reality of the situation, and they had to resource up from a relatively low base.
When you say relatively low base, were you struck by how low the base was?
They most certainly did not have a lot of construction expertise inside the organisation for a rebuild, and I mean, when you look at it, you would say they couldn't afford to carry that sort of overhead over a prolonged period of time when there might not be a disaster. But when that black swan event occurred, most certainly, if you look at it in hindsight, in our view, they were probably underprepared.
Would you have taken this project on as CEO of Fletcher Construction at the time, were it not for the indemnity against liability? No, I wouldn't. And,
that matter did get discussed. During the negotiations, there was some pushback from either EQC or Mr Brownlee's office, I can't remember which, to be honest, in which they asked Fletcher Construction to take on a higher degree of risk. And I was just not prepared to put Fletcher Construction in a position where we had to take on a huge, massive subcontractor base to undertake the work. As I explained previously, I mean, large construction contractors usually have preferred groups of subcontractors that they know they can rely on when doing a large project. But this was so massive, we were going to have to take on resources that we had never worked with before. Obviously, some of these subcontract resources coming in from offshore, and the risk that we would be taking relative to the fee meant that it was an absolutely stupid commercial decision to accept that liability. And at the end of the day, that position was accepted by EQC and the government.
As it turns out, if I look at 23, and even though you signed this contract, you don't actually have a copy with you now, so I'm at an advantage over you. But 23, indemnity, 23.1, EQC indemnifies FCC, that was Fletcher Construction, for all costs and expenses FCC may suffer and for any claims made against FCC in connection with FCC carrying out its obligations under this agreement. There was almost no risk for FCC at all, almost none.
Well, you've got to remember, we weren't doing the work ourselves. We were managing it. And the project was on just such a scale that we were going to take on resources we hadn't worked with before. And from a commercial point of view, it just would have been plain liability and not have such indemnities from the government. And to be honest, I don't think they would have got an indemnity of that nature from any party.
So had EQC not provided an indemnity against liability that was almost absolute, the Christchurch rebuilds wouldn't have happened?
Well, I can't say for certain what some other party might have done, John, but I most certainly would have been recommending to the Fletcher board that Fletcher Construction not proceed with the contract, that's for sure.
Stuart Smith, who is now the EQC spokesperson for the National Party, replaced Jerry Brownlee, of course, said on Checkpoint last night that he feels if there is a compelling case for repeated botch-ups in work by Fletcher Construction, EQC should take legal action against Fletcher Construction under this, or Fletcher Building, under this contract. Do you think that's even remotely possible?
I did used to be a lawyer, so I would think that suggested precedent is non-existent. I would think that that is a very long bow to draw.
No chance.
Well, in legal cases, there's always some chance, John. But I would have thought on the contract as I remember it, and my understanding of contract law, that would be a very, very difficult claim to make.
How profitable was it? If we look at the reimbursement of costs and fees, EQC will pay FCC for PMO services full reimbursement of all direct project costs reasonably and properly incurred in the project, including a multiplier of 21% on salaries and wages for FCC employees, and 3.5% of the amount paid by EQC to contractors, consultants and merchants for projects managed by FCC. What sort of money did you make in total out of the project?
Well, the project wasn't completed, John, by the time I finished. So you've got to remember I left Fletcher Construction, well, I left Fletcher Building back at the end of 2011. So I was responsible for negotiating the contract, setting up the Fletcher Construction infrastructure, making sure the interface with EQC worked and getting the project underway. But I did leave at the end of 2011, so you would have to ask Fletcher Building just how profitable it was, which would obviously depend on the scale of the cost of the total project.
But a 3.5% fee on work that ran into billions of dollars is a lot of money, isn't it?
Yeah, it is a lot of money, but there's a lot of work as well.
Are you surprised by the number of claims that are coming back now, particularly under the floor? Do you think those early scopes and early assessments were rigorous enough and robust enough and looked low enough? Because a lot of what was originally put down as cosmetic work, cracks in the walls, is now coming back for a second and third time, and there are big structural repairs required that have never been done under the floors of what looks like a surprisingly large number of homes.
Look, the scoping work, again, I left at the end of 2011, but during that initial phase, I mean, while EQC was building up and going from, I don't know, something like 20 people to something like 700, it's very similar to the size of Fletcher Construction's organisation. During that build-up period, where they were getting assessors in to do the scopes, I think it's fair to say there were probably some teething issues during that build-up phase. So some of the issues, might be understandable given the issues in resourcing and getting competent people in and good systems in. But as I say, right across the whole period since the quakes, I can't comment any further.
Were there people doing assessments in that period after, particularly after February, who simply weren't up to the job?
Well, again, I wouldn't like to say that, but when you resource up so quickly and you've got so much pressure, you're bringing so many people on board, you just have to say statistically, yes, you probably, in all probability, are going to get some people who are probably below the level required. You would hope that those people would be identified relatively quickly and replaced.
What sort of pressure were you under from the Minister and from EQC to work as expeditiously as possible? In other words, what were the KPIs around getting assessments, well, in fact, work done as fast as possible?
Well, remember, the assessments were being done by EQC assessors, so that wasn't in our scope. But look, I think it's fair to say, at the very beginning, we were under a lot of pressure, and I think Mr. Brownlee's office were trying to suggest we could do the whole scope of works in a fixed period of time. I won't mention what that period of time was, but it was relatively short. And we pointed out to them that there was going to be major issues in terms of gearing up, accommodation identification of subcontractor resources, getting it into the area, accommodating the people. It was clearly going to take a significant period of time. There's going to be issues with insurers. So, again, we pushed back and said, look, it is impossible to put a time frame, on this. And I think, if I recall correctly, at the time, I personally thought, look, this is probably going to take, up to about 5 years to complete. And, in hindsight, it's probably a little bit short on that requirement as well. But you've got to remember, as well as EQC, there's a lot of insurers to be dealt with at the same time, and the insurance position, of course, was less than clear with a lot of the claims. So there are a lot of elements involved, making it very, very difficult to put a project period on the contract.
Was the original timeframe the government and the Minister had in mind unrealistic, and was there pressure on you to work as fast as possible to meet that?
I would say the expectations were unrealistic, but that's why we pushed back and said, look, it's just impossible to do it within that time period. We thought impossible to do it. And so, we went according to the time frame in which we thought we could execute the project in an expeditious but appropriate manner.
And that brings us back, doesn't it, to the scopes, which you didn't do, EQC did. And a lot of the issues that we are now looking at are scopes which seem to have missed major structural damage and were done by people with little or no expertise in engineering or construction or building or really anything to do with repairing homes. Do you think there was pressure on people to do those scopes as fast as possible, consistent with the government's sense of a time frame around the rebuild?
I think there was a lot of pressure on everybody, John, to perform. And as I say, when you expand an organisation from 20, or it might have been 22 people, through to, I might be wrong with the 700, at least 400 people, a lot of whom are assessors, and getting systems that are going to work appropriately, it becomes a very difficult task. And in hindsight, maybe some of the assessors weren't up to it, and a little bit more time in the planning process might have been fortuitous, but of course it's very easy to make these comments in hindsight when people, the head of EQC and all the people in EQC, are under a huge amount of pressure to see action, and it's probably understandable that they were going at a heck of a pace. And goodness knows what the political furore would have been if they'd been slower.
That's former Fletcher boss Mark Binns. Checkpoint asked former EQC CEO Ian Simpson, who signed that contract with Mark Binns. He declined to be interviewed. Former EQC Minister Jerry Brownlee is in UA and also declined to comment. We will look at issues developing from all of this on Checkpoint tomorrow night.